Hello and welcome again. I'm speaking with Lee Ivett of Baxendale, and Lee, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Ambrose. My name is Lee Ivett, and I am a founder of my own practice called Baxendale, and I'm also the course leader in undergraduate architecture at the Grenfell Baines Institute of Architecture, which is based in my hometown of Preston. And I increasingly situate my own work more as research rather than business, because it doesn't work, as Ambrose knows. And so everything I make is usually trying to ask and answer questions of the situation in which it's being made, but also broader questions about the role of making and the act of making as a tool for research and inquiry as well.
So there's a couple of things. There's this, there's the big issue is making community. Is community?
I mean, I suppose that's the thing I didn't mention there, is that the context within which I've worked predominantly in the kind of last 14, 15 years have been in contexts of some form of marginalization. So that has usually took its form as being in communities considered to be socially and economically deprived, housing estates, peripheral kind of rural town village situations. So that idea of making, I suppose, originally was seen by me as a potential tool for engagement. It's a kind of way of finding out about a place, but also collaborating with a place in some form or another, and also creating acts of making that were so simple that people could engage with them, without having to be taught a huge amount of skills or having to bring a huge amount of knowledge to the table. So I think the starting point was probably an analysis of certain areas and situations that clearly needed something, and the way in which that something was being identified was through quite arduous, tortuous community consultation and engagement exercises, when the immediate needs seemed so obvious, as it was clear that things could or needed or should be done immediately, and that the evidence for that was actually experiential and visible. You didn't necessarily need to go and ask 1,000 people, what don't you like and what do you like, or what do you want and what don't you want, to know that something was a little bit fucked, and I suppose then for me, I was interested in how immediate acts of making might, even in the short term, just be something that just made something a little bit better than it was, or fixed something, or improved something, or at least pointed, that rather than filling in a form or filling in a questionnaire or playing a game with a consultant, you kind of you suggested something through an act of making. You suggested something through action, rather than just speculation, or rather than just some kind of documented desire, I suppose.
So there's an implicit criticism of architectural practice in there. There's one of the kind of participatory architecture, which, as you say, 1,000 questionnaires to find out what you could work out by simply driving around and looking. And then there seems to me to be also a critique of, I suppose, larger scale architecture or normal architectural practice. You said, sort of implied that in a way that in these marginalized communities, stuff is done without reference to the communities themselves. Like, things get built, practice isn't looking at these kind of places properly. Instead, it just builds in these places. Yeah,
I mean, I'm not even sure what, I mean, there's very interesting questions about, the manner in which architectural practice is either just complacent or is complicit, in kind of modes of conceiving and delivering architecture that actually doesn't really have anything to do with, the specific dynamics of a situation as it exists in the here and now. I mean, I came into this kind of work or this kind of thinking as a result of choosing to do my part 2 at Strathclyde on the urban design course. So rather than doing my part 2 through the advanced architectural design strand, I kind of signed up for urban design, and mainly because by that point I'd become interested in why a lot of what gets built and designed by architects isn't actually very good. And I was also very interested in the spaces in between buildings. I was interested in the kind of way in which architecture is situated and why it's situated like that and what it chooses to acknowledge or doesn't. And I was interested in ideas of poverty and disenfranchisement. It's like Glasgow. I mean, by that point, I'd spent enough time in Glasgow and had come across instances of poverty that I'd never experienced. I couldn't begin to believe that like 20th century at the time, 20th, whatever century it was.
21st.
Just about 21st. Maybe like, 2001 kind of, I'm kind of finding bits of Glasgow where it's hard to conceive that consider living in a developed Western society, that actually we have conditions and environments that people are living in that actually are potentially deeply unfair and unjust and unpleasant. So I was interested in all those things. So I kind of chose to do urban design because the urban design course was also kind of situating itself within the north of Glasgow in areas, social housing estates, working with some like housing associations, etc. And part of that, we started getting introduced to, the master plans for these areas. And the more I looked at these master plans, like the more I didn't understand. I didn't kind of. You begin to realize that all that's happening is really, it's a kind of that really a load of people either don't like the way these places look, and they don't like the way the people in them look, and they want to make it look better. And then you realize that the reason actually they want to make it look better is so that other people might want to live there too. And then you kind of think naively, well, that's not a bad thing. It's like social diversity is a good thing, and kind of mixed tenure is a good thing, and all these things. But then you realize actually what is really happening here is you're going to like knock these places down and build them again so that, nicer, more economically active, palatable people will move in and pay more tax and set up coffee shop. All the cliches around gentrification and things like that on one hand, but on the other hand, just there's basically this repeat demolition model. And like in Glasgow, there's places that have been knocked down and rebuilt now 4 times in 100 years. So you start to realize as well that, like, where does architecture even sit into this? Because if it's like architecture gets positioned as the problem a lot, and it also gets positioned as an answer a lot.
Yeah. Yet
we're now basically giving buildings 25 years, and then we're just knocking them down and building new buildings. So all of that made me believe that maybe smaller scale interventions, and rather than having to wait, because that was the other thing with the master plan, was like you have this kind of like year-long consultation process, and then you have this year-long design process, and then you have this multi-year funding process, and then maybe 5-6 years after you've started thinking there's a problem, there is a plan, and then that plan, you know, and I'm like, well, why are we waiting? Why are we coming up with, you know, master plans for 2020 or 2030 and things like that, when there's some stuff that just needs sorting out now, this weekend, next week, next month.
Yeah.
And actually maybe we can sort those things out, and maybe so for me then it was a question of what can you do with £50, £200, £1,000, what can you do right now, and how can you do that in a way that is still aspirational in some sense. So even if you're just building stuff out of rubbish or reusing things, that there's always something that's aspirational about what you're doing, you know, in terms of, maybe not in terms of its like craft or like I say, its material quality, but it's suggestive of something more. It's always suggestive of something more. So it can exist on its own terms. But the ideal scenario is it starts to create some kind of momentum, some kind of suggestion, something that does lead to more serious, permanent and long-term change, but that change is more organic and emergent than a solution that is visualized as a grand plan, a grand gesture, and then imposed.
And to what extent does this small scale intervention thing derive from you as the architect, your perception, your imagination, and does it derive from, say, a community's kind of guidance? You know, so do you when you go, you know, if you go to a really impoverished, marginalized place and you're like, well, I know what needs doing here, and I'm going to do it this weekend, it's going to cost me 50 quid. I think that how do you know you're kind of on the right track?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that falls into probably different scales and layers and types of action. So, you know, there's a lot of communities I've worked in, I've ended up working within those situations for years. And I think that, like, my immediate engagement with a place is always to spend time participating in that place, rather than kind of asking that place to participate with me in some kind of, you know. And quite often you get forced into the usual tropes depending on like who's commissioning something or where the funding's coming from. And these people like to see like some numbers in terms of how many people you engage with and blah blah, all that kind of stuff. So quite often I was having to like do that just because that I needed something to look like that had been done in that way. But at the same time, the really useful stuff was more just situating myself in a place and experiencing it myself, and I suppose my own, you know, the stuff that delighted me about the place, or the stuff that frustrated me about the place, or annoyed me about the place, or made me scared or happy, or to trust my own instincts on the one hand, but then through conversation with the people that I met, through eating there or living there or buying things there or going to the shop there or attending group, you know, because a lot of the time these places are kind of deemed as having no, you know, as being kind of socially and culturally inactive. And actually they're generally not. There's usually actually loads of stuff going on.
Yeah,
it's just not like the stuff that
chamber orchestras. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you know, you know, it's like, you know, I was in Milton earlier. I was going to like bingo, you know, I was like going to bingo nights in little sheds, youth clubs, you know, at the back of schools, and I was kind of meeting people who got together to drink in the woods because there was no pub, you know. And this wasn't, you know, the people who were getting together drinking in the woods were just middle-aged adults who didn't have a pub, you know. It wasn't, you know, it's some who had made bins, and you know, it wasn't some it wasn't antisocial behavior, you know what I mean? But it's like, to another set of eyes, it was actually very social behavior, actually, you know. But and And so you start to, and I think for me, the biggest clues for what a place needed started to be the actions that people were already taking themselves.
Yeah.
Either whether those actions were antisocial in the way that people call stuff antisocial, or whether they were social, or whether they were just people going about trying to pick up litter themselves, or kids painting goalposts on a wall, you know, and then all the, you know, the cliche of like the desire line, blah, blah, you know, the kind of worn paths. But, you know, in a lot of places, people through their own behavior are suggesting what they need because they're trying to find their own agency or autonomy with it in spite of the conditions. So that always ended up for me being the biggest clues, was like actually documenting what already happens, because loads of stuff was already happening, and some of it was a bingo night over here, and some of it was, you know, like a coffee morning over there, or some of it was some people having a drink in the woods, or some of it was seeing that kids like to play football over there. And then you can start saying, all right, well, how do we as designers try and find a way of either legitimizing those acts or facilitating those acts or providing for those acts in a way that helps them to establish themselves and progress and become something kind of greater or more meaningful or more permanent or more accepted than they currently are. So that was, for me, the work that was most successful probably followed that kind of mode of inquiry and action and response, you know, was that actually the stuff that needed to happen was probably maybe already happening, but like you had to kind of look for it. And quite often it was happening in spite, you know, of the situation.
So there's a kind of a requirement for a very a generosity in interpreting and viewing these spaces, which I think is a perennial problem for architects. But you talked about this kind of master planning method, and I think, you know, this incredibly long time scales that these development plans and urban development plans kind of operate on, and within that there might be something offered to lower income and more marginalized, deprived communities. And then you're talking, so it's a very long time frame that they operate over, and yet within that there seems to be precious little time actually spent communicating or trying to understand the social processes that make those communities function or not function, or somewhere between the two, most likely. And then you're talking about the process that you engage with or you enact, which is also a very slow temporal process, but it's at a totally different scale. And I think that issue of time, that the way that architects or architecture is, I guess my question is architecture not involved at the right points in these broader urban development projects? Is it that you don't get architects at the beginning, you don't get architects you get them sort of 6 months before the end when they want a design of something, and then the architect's brought in and all of the consultation, all of the engagement, all of the whatever it is has happened already, and the architect's just there to kind of draw a picture? And
yeah, I mean, I think there's a bigger question about the passiveness, the way in which architects have, for some reason, allowed themselves to be extremely passive in terms of, you know, the concept, you know, what the potential motivation and conception or rationale for a piece of architecture even is, and also become pretty passive in terms of, you know, it's the management of its construction, but also the management of its budget. It's you're like, we've kind of removed ourselves over the course of 25 years from all the stuff, or we've been pushed, I don't know, pushed out of or removed ourselves.
I mean, it strikes me, like 20 years is true. It's been really quick, like since the millennium, basically.
And, you know, you think now that, you know, the project manager emerged as a thing in the design team, and now there's design managers have emerged in the design team on like bigger contracts and stuff. And there's obviously quantity surveyors have been around now for quite a long time, and health and safety and
conservation consultants, planning consultants.
Yeah, planning consult. So there's this question of, we either have willingly or passively or whatever it is just kind of said, we just like to draw nice pictures and kind of actually, maybe all that stuff's a bit hard and a bit boring, and I don't know, I don't know where it comes from, but the result of that is all that other stuff is the stuff that makes the pretty pictures happen, right? So if you've lost agency over the kind of mechanisms of delivery, and now I think we've also lost agency over the kind of mechanisms of conception as well, so if you're not able to really, really, really inform a need, a desire, a rationale for the thing, then what you're left with is someone telling you what to create, and then loads of other people telling you how to create it. And you're trapped in the middle of those two situations, feeling really, really frustrated and pissed off, because you're battling a load of other people's agendas, and your voice is no longer like one of 2 or 3 voices in that conversation, the client, the contractor, and you as the lead. You're now like actually now a kind of minor voice amongst a whole team of consultants, plus a client's representative, plus a client, and it's like our own ability to inform not just the design of architecture, but its conception and the process of its delivery is increasingly marginalized. And I think that problem also then comes back to your question, so it's like, well, do we as architects even want to be, do we want to be involved in consulting and engaging with communities and testing things out and testing ideas and figuring out what the right thing to do is versus, the thing that we're being told, or I don't see, there's loads of architects actually, there's increasingly more architects interested in that thing, but they're the architects who are getting written about in the AJ and the Reba Journal and in magazines and stuff. There's still loads and 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 loads of other practices, who aren't those like 10 practices who get talked about in that way. So and so there's still for the majority of architects probably in the country, their job is trying to deliver what a client is telling them to deliver for their agenda, for their budget, for their profit, and that is what you're actually
and if the architect gets marginalized in this process, and you're talking about deprived communities, they didn't even get a look in. There's no space for them within that.
Well,
you don't want to. If you've already got this multi-agency kind of task force dealing with this stuff, and then you introduce a community of people who are probably quite pissed off, often enough if they're very, very deprived and overlooked, and also, not led, or there's no very little kind of community organization. Then you basically are saying you're going to introduce 25 really loud people into the room as well.
Yeah, I also think that a lot of, some of the issues that I found were, it's very hard. Well, things that I found very hard were obviously trying to suggest in a situation, in a community, that the new school and the new community centre that was being offered by like a council or a housing association might not be a good thing, right? And it might not be a good thing because that community weren't going, you know, own it. Or if they were going to own it and were going to manage it, they were probably going to be exploited, like in a way, you know, in some form or another.
Yeah.
You know, there'd be people would be working for free, and they would have something that is called an asset, but might actually be a burden. You know that, you know that maybe, and that actually, you know, this new school that is being promised, or this new community centre that's being promised, is just replacing what used to be a separate library, a separate kindergarten, a separate community centre, a separate theatre, 3 primary schools. You know, like, it's like, well, all right, you're getting off of this new thing, but that new thing is replacing like 6 things that you used to have.
Yeah. And
maybe should kind of question like what this is really, you know, like, but again, it's like as soon as, but the narrative, of course, isn't we're demolishing all your assets and squeezing them into one thing that's going to try and do the job of all those things, and we'll probably do it in a bad way, because actually it's quite hard to, you know, make something so multi-purpose and not, you know, and it's hard to compete. That isn't the narrative. You know, the narrative is we're spending £12 million on a new school and community centre, and obviously to people that have seen all this other stuff get run down or closed down, or, you know, have felt disenfranchised and marginalised, then people who come bearing gifts, it can all looks pretty good, you know. So you end up in this situation where even a lot of the new stuff that gets offered to a community, or even the opportunity to create new stuff in a community, especially at a larger scale, multi-million pound scale, isn't really new.
No,
like it's replacing something that has deemed to have failed. But then when you look at why that thing has failed, it's because of a lack of maintenance, investment, care, you know, and have you fixed that, like that? Because actually the issue here is not the need for a new building. The issue here is that the previous buildings and the previous activity and the previous culture and the previous social events weren't looked after.
Yeah.
No, they weren't supported, they weren't funded, they weren't. So what has that been, you know, is that kind of structural deficiency been addressed? Because if that hasn't been addressed, and like modes of behavior at an individual level or an institutional level or organizational level haven't been addressed, then you can keep building whatever the fuck you want, but it's still, and it can look as beautiful as you want. But if it's actually being placed in a culture that actually doesn't or won't care for it, invest in it, support it, then we're back at that 20-year cycle of knocking stuff down and rebuilding it. You know, like there's new community centres been getting built in Glasgow over the last 10 years, all over the place. But then, you know, you look into the history of that stuff, you think, well, it's not like there was never it's very rare you find a place that hasn't actually at some point had a community centre, or had some kind of art centre, or had some kind of hall, or had some kind of amenity. And
one of the things that thinking about that's the example of the school, the community centre is just as good, I suppose. Where you get this consolidation of a huge number of functions into a single unit, and then it doesn't work, because the reason why there's 3 schools, 2 theatres, a WI centre and all of that is that's because that's how many buildings you need to achieve the social good, like the social critical social capacity. So you get rid of 3 schools, you got rid of 3 school gates, and 3 school, for say stay-at-home mums, for example, or parents, the school gate's a critical space. You remove that, and all of a sudden
you remove all these routes between places, you know, like, and it's like, that's the kind of thing where all of a sudden, like, if all you have to do during a day as a parent, for example, is to kind of get out, take your child out of your flat, your house, get in a lift, get in a stairwell, go outside, go to a school, come home, maybe stop by a small local shop, like if that's actually your kind of experience of a lot of the environment within which you inhabit, that there isn't a kind of, and I don't mean like it's not necessarily about filling places with kind of consumerist delight, or anything like that, but it's still you're not engaged by lots of different activity, or you're not kind of, or your choice, your choices in terms of how to behave or how to engage with other people or how to be social or how to consume or whatever, if all of that stuff is limited to very, very, very narrow experiences, then I think that is
so this is
antisocial and quite dehumanizing, basically.
So this is where your kind of idea of the smaller scale thing gains its specific validity, in that it kind of transforms the urban experience into something that enables social engagement. Is that what it's doing? Is it specifically orientated, or is it also to create objects that are like art pieces in and of themselves beautiful and simply valuable because of that? So
I think originally it was when I started doing or thinking about this stuff when I was doing the masters in urban design, like the idea of making small scale things was very much about like meeting some kind of immediate need through a kind of ethnographic and empathic experience of a place, and was and there was a desire then that those things are beautiful in some way, and there was then also a desire that people local to a situation could participate in that in some way. And originally, I suppose part of that participation was also naively drawn from this idea that people who get involved in stuff won't ruin it, blah, 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 which I've come to think is like really misguided and actually very patronizing and, quite often, it's like trying to,
because isn't that one of the things that hangs at the center of participation? If people are involved in its making or design, then it creates a sense of ownership, and therefore they're
and that goes back to, again, actually pointing the finger at these people and saying you're the reason why this place is a mess, is because it's your, it's not the fact that we took away all your jobs and your support and amenity, and dumped you on the edge of the city with like, one shit bus every hour, and then let gangsters run your neighborhoods for 30 years. It's not that that's the problem. It's, the fact that you're like, and you're naughty. And if you get involved in this, you'll be less naughty. You'll be less likely to be naughty.
Yeah, exactly. If you get to paint your front door, you're not naughty. You won't need police.
So and part of the realization that was bullshit was also because I know that the stuff that I am probably the least careful with is my own stuff. Like actually, the more I have a sense of ownership over something, the more I feel it's my right to fuck it up. So
so I drive hire cars much more carefully than I drive my own car.
But yeah, exactly. Actually look after other people's stuff far more than my own. So that whole mentality around that I kind of started to realize was kind of rubbish, but that there was still, and that the value in people participating in the making was more, again, as a tool for starting conversations or building some skills or giving people an outlet, because in a lot of neighborhoods, people didn't have stuff to do, or felt that they didn't have stuff to do, or there wasn't a variety of things to do, that the stuff, especially adults, because most of the time people would say, oh, the problem here is there's not enough stuff for the kids. And then what I started to learn is that actually there's quite a lot of stuff for the kids, but there was very little for the adults. And actually the frustrations of place were always articulated by adults through the lens of children quite often, you know, unless it was really like old people in which they were just, you know, frustrated and pissed off with the kids. Like not, whereas, you know, like kind of middle-aged, you know, or adults from mid-20s to 40s and that they always articulated the issues of place through the lens of children or young people. And didn't speak actually a lot about their own kind of needs, but it was clear that they did, you know, actually the needs for the adult population actually were probably more latent than for young people. So yeah, getting involved in making something, I think, you know, there's a value in that is actually not legitimized through the idea that you'll have a sense of ownership over something and then you'll look after it. It's more that actually it's kind of healthy and it's good, and you can have conversations in a much more collaborative and natural way when you're making something with someone than if you stood with a clipboard or you're trying to play some consultation game on a table. You know, it's like actually that situation is more real in some way, you know, it's or less abstract than some of the kind of ways in which communities are consulted. So that kind of so the small scale stuff and the making of the small scale stuff allowed that type of engagement to happen on a kind of in a way that felt more meaningful, less abstract. It potentially originally was about just trying to like see if we could do something positive that didn't require a lot of money, but would then show that action was possible. And then following that, I suppose when I became more and more aware of, you know, this, you know, the big stuff tended to fail anyway on over a 20-25 year cycle.
Yeah.
Whether it was like a new community centre or whether it was new housing or whether you like or whatever it was, that actually it seemed like the master plan was something that actually had to be redone every 25 years. I then started thinking, well, how do you know what the right thing to do is? And that's when, for me, like this act of doing small things and making things started to become quite often about prototyping at a small scale. So it kind of, on the one hand, it could be about what can we do quickly and cheaply and affordably to try and make something better in some way, or what can we make or do or enact that tests a bigger future scenario, you know, like actually starts to go like, well, actually, would that be a good idea? Would it work? Would people be interested in it? You know, and so then the idea that actually, if, you know, like putting on like building the most basic infrastructure to have an outdoor film screening or providing an environment for people to come and test activity in, you know, so then also it started to become maybe less about the making of small scale permanent physical things and more about what is it you need to make to allow an activity to happen, you know. So if people are kind of saying, oh, it'd be good to get together once a week and put on a gig, then you're like, all right, well, what do we need for that? You know, do we need a stage? Do we need some seats? Do we need a room? Do we not need a room? Like what's the kind of most basic infrastructure that we can create and design and provide to allow these people to do that thing, and then to see if that thing becomes a bigger thing and a bigger thing and a bigger thing. And as it becomes a bigger thing, then that is now telling you what you need, you know, like you're not saying, right, we're going to build a £6 million theatre, and until we build a £6 million community theatre, no one can do any theatre, you know, or music. You know, you're kind of what you're saying is, oh, some people here maybe already do this thing in this way and would like to do more of it with more people, and what's that next level up from doing it in your house, or doing it in this way, or just doing it with 5 people? And then what's that next level of infrastructure that allows that next level of activity to be tested? And then if it doesn't work, then there's not a whole lot lost. And if it does work, then its momentum will mean that the kind of larger scale architecture will become an inevitability anyway. You know, like that will emerge because it will quite simply be needed, you know.
Yeah.
And you'll know it's needed because
well, because the thing itself operates as a kind of register for needs and values of both, I suppose, of the people there, but of also the place in a holistic sense, in the sense of it as a geographical space, as an environmental space, as an economic space, as a kind of
yeah, and it's like that, and also that kind of when you also then put, you know, so for me then also the conversation became less about just communities having a sense of ownership over a physical thing, you know, which was probably where the discourse or the conversation about this work maybe started when I started doing it about 15 years ago. You know, was like, you get people to participate in something because it will either legitimize a development process, or it will inform a development process, or it will give people a sense of ownership over something. And then you start to think, well, the one thing that's better than a sense of ownership over something is like actually owning something. You know, like that's better than, you know, and then you realize that maybe actually like ownership over just a physical thing, I don't know, like a multi-purpose urban games park or a community center or whatever, is maybe also not as good as owning the process of that thing. You're like actually owning the process of change, essentially, you know, like, and then you also start to realize that actually trying to own the process of kind of program and activity, like actually all of these things need to be considered simultaneously, you know, is like the physical spatial thing, the activity thing, and then the actual process of the delivery of those things, you know, and like the more in which that more, the more for me anyway, the ideal situation is that a local situation of people and place is able to have ownership over those 3 things, but with the support of expertise, you know, as and when it's required. You know, like, okay, maybe we can or maybe we cannot write plays, right? Yeah. Like as a local people, but we like theatre, we like perform, you know, and so we have the capacity now to go and procure that or commission that or whatever, but it's not being commissioned by others and imposed on us. We're kind of saying like, let's try this, let's try that, let's do this, let's bring them, you know. So the other kind of value in like doing these small scale things, and again, increasingly those small scale things were not actually about the physical thing or the object or the spatial thing or the designed thing by myself, but we're more about the kind of swing dance event on a Sunday, or the barbecue thing, or the cinema thing, or the outdoor mud kitchen thing, or like it was actually that people all of a sudden didn't just have ideas, but they also had agency over those ideas, and agency over and an ability and the support to test those ideas or establish those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just the word I keep that well. So you talked earlier about this idea of the architect having some sort of become disinvested, either through their own will or through the will of others, from the architectural design process, becoming kind of a small aspect of a much wider thing. And this is, I think this is undeniable, and it's massively affected the way that architects self-conceptualize. but that's quite clearly also true from the basis of the community as well. That community, because what you're describing is essentially natural organic processes of community development, and that for some reason, radical inequality being part of it, but not possibly the whole thing, communities themselves have stopped feeling like they can do this. And I don't want to get too much back into the problematic, so to speak, rather than the way that you approach the solution, which I think is really fascinating. This idea of doing the least amount of architecture possible in a way to procure the maximum quantity of programmatic and spatial use and improvement, which I think is it's a really elegant thing. I suppose, how does this sit? So there's two things for me that come off the back of this. How does this sit within the wider urban development thing? How does such a small scale and granular process affect meaningful change at scale? Because when we're talking about urban inequality now, we have, as you pointed out about Glasgow, but you could very well say in most cities in the post-industrial world and every city in the global south, the level of the problem is so vast that but for incredibly large scale actors working without any restraint, the problem is, I mean, on the ground, it's people burying their children. It's really major issues here. So how does that small scale process operate at bigger scale? Does it even want to? Is that the wrong way of thinking about it? Is that someone else's problem, and what we're talking about here is just?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always wanted it to exist at a larger scale or inform a larger scale. And in, I don't know, through my own naivety or whatever desire, wanted a situation where the organizations that I either worked with or helped establish would become big, powerful things, I suppose, right?
Well, that did essentially happen in Leeds.
And some of them have. And some of them have, but like, when I still chat to, when I'm chatting to Jeannie about these things these days in Beath, like, she still can't, even with all they're doing, and even though they own like a 13-acre site and they run loads of activity, they employ loads of people, North Ayrshire Council will still decide that, what is needed in this area is a new kind of community thing down by the Lockshore, and that the local rugby club should kind of own it and run it, but it should also offer kind of a bit more than just be a still. Even though like a local authority or big institution could support in a bigger way what these development trusts, they're still, even with all the success they have, still do not necessarily have a level of influence, and it still probably feels like what they're doing, they're kind of having to do still in spite of maybe local politics and established democratic institutions and stakeholders.
Is it about enabling a parallel process? Is that what it becomes? Rather, if these leviathans, these beasts of local authority and commercial builders and construction firms and so on, social housing, if they're completely impervious to this kind of human scale development process, is it about creating parallel processes is there a reciprocity? Is there a possibility of reciprocity?
I don't know. In some cases there is, but I think I now probably believe that what has emerged is there are parallel processes, and that's not necessarily healthy.
Yeah.
And you know, why should local people who sit within an existing system of organizational democracy have to then go and build their own community centers and run them themselves?
Yeah. Taxation
Like,
without representation. I mean, it's
like, what the fuck is that? And why should the means of paying for that be working class gambling addiction through the national lottery? So, you know, like, so what, so, you know, currently, you know, the system of community grassroots renewal is to like beg for money and support off big stakeholders, and then go and beg the national lottery for money that you spent chasing the dream of winning millions of pounds.
Or just a tenner.
Yeah, just a tenner, you know. You know, it's like, it's the biggest scam ever, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, you know, like, actually, we're gonna,
I mean, it's so ballsy. You've got to give them credit. You've got to give them credit. Whoever came up with the idea of national lottery funding.
Instead of taxing rich people fairly,
yeah,
to pay for the essential amenity that would empower those at the lowest levels of society, what we're going to do is we're going to create a competition that those people will pay money to engage in, and then we're going to make those people beg for that money back so that they can have community centers, and stuff.
And it could be you.
Yeah, you know,
it could be. It probably won't be, but it could be.
Yeah, like that, like, you know, and so that's mad, really.
Yeah.
and that's and you know, and then you realize, like, or I realized, you know, that you're now part of this like mad crazy game, because you feel like you have to create this parallel method, because if you don't, then stuff isn't going to get better. And yeah, like, increasingly think, well, this is all really odd. It's really weird. And it's like, even in like Preston at the moment, there's a thing called the Preston model that is being talked about, which is, you know, Preston's Labour administration have started to create a more locally based procurement model, and they're also working to establish, you know, collective, like workers' cooperatives and collectives, and trying to foster that. And I've kind of been talking to the leader of the Preston City Council a bit more about these things, Matthew Brown, who's a dead good guy. But again, this conversation that emerges is that, well, like, why is a city council actually now having to create parallel systems in order for the right thing to happen? You know, like, because why can't we have a granular democracy? Like, why can't we have responsibility and representation at the level of the cul-de-sac or the street, or, you know, that's all tied into systems of, you know, wealth redistribution or economy or whatever, you know, whatever it is, that's all tied into ways in which people can earn money, make money, invest money, or whatever, you know. So it feels like we've created, again, a kind of third sector competition culture that, again, breeds levels of paranoia and nastiness within third sector organizations, whether it's like arts organizations, community organizations, or whatever, that are kind of living in a perpetual state of fear. You know, like that's what seems to emerge, is like you end up being fearful of your funding, you're fearful of your support, you're fearful of your reputation. And so fragility is like just inherent at every point within this parallel third sector mode of change. And I probably are coming to, you know, like a point that I don't think that's acceptable. And I don't know necessarily, like, you know, what, it's almost like the answer to that, you know, like the perfect situation is almost like so hard to imagine could ever be possible, you know, like ever be possible, that you feel like an idiot for even like thinking that we might have this, you know, we might have a system of democracy that actually provides and supports through the existing modes of it. You know, like we have councils, we have elected representatives, we have taxation, we have budget, you know, like that all of that stuff that actually kind of already exists in some form could and should be the thing that is doing all this stuff that I've been involved in, you know, and then actually you think back 40, 50 years, and that is what happened.
Yeah.
And actually the architects who were designing schools and magistrates courts and police stations worked for the council.
Yeah.
And the people who spoke to communities about what they needed were local representatives and people who worked for the council, you know, and there wasn't like a divestment of expertise and, you know, like we kind of privatized everything.
Well, it's based around this idea that competition breeds innovation, and that, you know, is true to a certain extent, but I think probably less true in arts organizations, and certainly so you end up with this very, very high turnover of kind of organizations who are, as you say, you know, fighting for a bit of national lottery money or a bit of local authority funding. I mean, we've had this grotesqueness recently, haven't we, of this leveling up fund where they've been getting local regions to fight for some money to stop things going to shit.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's like, and more to the point, they get them to fight for chicken feed. I mean, it is staggeringly small sums of money.
Yeah, I mean, I had this discussion recently based around this like Preston model thing where, you know, it's like the Preston model's based on concepts of community wealth building. And then the discussion then about participatory budget involved, you know, so, and again, what that comes down to is basically creating groups at a local level that then decide how money is spent within that area, or inform how money is spent in that area. And there's potential for that could be quite good. But what I tend to see is that kind of stuff ends up being turned into some kind of X Factor style,
you
know, like we need it most thing, you know. And so again, you've got this situation that is not based on like a kind of empirical and quantitative or experiential identification of that needs sorting out right now, so spend the fucking money on it, you know. Or there's a strategy, you know, that is like, right, okay, well, we'll start here, start there, we'll do a bit there. It's like, right, who needs it the most? Put your hands up and dance for it, you know. And that's again, I kind of don't necessarily, you know, it's like, where does the expertise sit into those conversations? Where's the nuance? Where's the, you know, the knowledge that informs people's ability to vote or make that decision or whatever, you know, when you've just got organizations competing, saying we need it the most, and then local people like voting, you know. So I think even some of that kind of stuff again is not being considered, you know. I think it's still a way off actually being as useful or meaningful as it could be. And I think that's the big tension in a lot of this stuff, is like, where does the space exist for expertise? You know, like, what form does that expertise take? Who commissions that? Who procures it? Who listens to it? Who ignores it? Who, you know, and then who decides? Yeah, you know, like all of these things seem to be the kind of point, you know, or some of the points of tension within this kind of work. And obviously expertise at a political level has been demonized a lot at a national level, you know, especially architects. We've let ourselves basically be described by politicians as just a kind of extravagant, flamboyant, money wasting, space wasting kind of, you know, that need all these other people around us to control, you know, our whatever egos, ambitions, and you know, like obviously 50% of that's probably true. You know, but, yeah, but again, like that's however that situation has emerged where people can kind of describe us in that way and people believe it, you know, it's something that we need to like look as a profession, you know, is like why are we viewed in that way, and why are we viewed in that way by secretaries of state and prime ministers, and you know, like why when people at the very, very top of the political hierarchy want advice and want to be informed about the built environment, did he tend to speak to architects after they've spoken to philosophers, cost consultants,
Jamie Oliver?
yeah, celebrity chefs. Yeah, you know, like what? How come we're not like first in the queue when they want to kind of be informed on how to make the built environment?
Yeah. That's really interesting. I just think it would be quite interesting to talk about how we teach this, because you're obviously a teacher and I'm a teacher, and how do we move away within the architectural practice, architectural education tends to be orientated around objects and heroes. And heroes are nice and objects are nice, so it's kind of seductive and it keeps on keeping on, doesn't it? As an educational model. And maybe that's fine. Maybe it's important that we know about Louis Kahn and Gunnar Asplund and Alvarado and people like that. But also, obviously, if architects are going to get out of the doldrums, out of the margins, peculiarly enough, and get involved in the margins, so stop just operating for as Al Parvin says, you know, for the 1%, a business model that's orientated towards the 1%. I mean, literally affordable only by a very small fraction of the population. Then how do we teach this? What does teaching this look like? And is it something that we should teach? Or I suppose, you know, what do you think?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things, like when I took this job as a course leader and I was kind of looking at, I suppose, you know, all the course documentation that already existed for the course that I'm now involved in. And when I was kind of looking into also the kind of language of UCLAN in terms of its own mission and stuff, you started kind of, realize there's an idea about how we, you know, support, how we create, you know, like graduates who are ready for industry, who are going to support local practice, and all of this. And then there's a big part here that says, like, I don't want any of my students working in the vast majority of practices the northwest of England. Or there's a big part of me that is like, well, the industry's pretty fucked. Like, you know, like we need to create students who are going to counter that, you know, or are going to progressively inform it in some way, and are not going to get trapped in this model that you just described that is geared towards just facilitating the continued acquisition of wealth by, you know, the 1% or whoever. So then you're like, okay, but I also really want to make sure my students get a job. Get a job. You know, like it's so you're caught in. So you're then caught between, like, how do you teach it? You know, because I want to make sure on the one hand that as many of my students, especially in Preston, at an architecture school in Preston that doesn't have a culture of entitlement, whose students do come from a more diverse range of backgrounds, whose expectations of themselves are different than the expectations of a lot of other students in architecture schools who have, you know, always been successful and got good grades and expect to do well and probably will do well. You know, it's a different situation. I don't want to kind of, impose some kind of supposedly radical pedagogy or whatever bullshit, you know, it gets described as, you know, by other people who think they're imposing radical pedagogies in architecture.
Always.
You know, like, and then they can't even get a job because they, you know, they end up being so disenfranchised with what is out there, you know. And for a lot of my students, probably their dream is at the end of it, they just get a job, you know, like actually this desire to change the world or change the nature of the profession is my desire first and not always theirs. Now that's different in other architecture schools. It's different in other parts of the UK. It's different in other situations, like whatever, where in other situations, those students coming in and saying to their tutors, why aren't you teaching me how to change the world? Like, why aren't you teaching me how to, like, be more sustainable or more equitable or more accessible or whatever? Whereas it's more mixed, you know, in terms of, like, I think our own students, and that those desires or those things, kind of emerge through hearing different voices and having conversations. And I suppose one of the first things for me was probably, in terms of the briefs and the projects that I had some level of agency over, was just starting to, like, change the language of some of them, away from being very heavy-handedly, you know, referential in terms of theory, and trying to make the point of what was being taught and what we were doing quite understandable, you know, like actually not wrapping up actually what is, you know, it's like architecture actually is only complex because we've built a complex culture around it to justify, you know, having fun with it. It's like, it's just to justify doing some mad shit. And you know, but it's not, it doesn't actually have to be maybe as hard as we make it. But then in not making it as hard as we make it also doesn't mean that it's not clever or it's not aspirational or it's not beautiful or delightful or joyful or complex in other ways. So I think there's something about, the language of architecture that it has kind of adopted over the last 50, 60 years that is actually quite inaccessible and disenfranchising. There is then, I think, the types of projects that students get asked to do as well, you know, so like, I don't know why I don't, it's like giving my students a kind of big theatre brief or an art gallery brief or something that actually has, you know, like what I wanted to do was create briefs that had a thesis behind them that was representative of the people and the place within which that was suggested, you know, so kind of having a cool corner site in a city and saying, right, we're going to stick a gallery on it without being able to communicate to the students a narrative of why there should be a gallery on it, for me is not useful, you know. So like, so with every brief that I'm setting, I want to be able to say, this is the rationale for creating a piece of architecture either here or in this town or in this place. Or if I'm saying to students, go and find a site, then each project has an agenda that can be referenced back to an analysis of the potential needs of that place and its people. And sometimes that thesis is kind of provided by myself. In other cases, obviously there is exercises done that allow that thesis to emerge through exploration that the students do, so there's different ways in which we analyze Blackpool, for example, and the students quite quickly realize that there's some stuff going on there that's odd or unfair or amazing or cool. Like there's a condition there that is Blackpool, and the way in which a building fits into that condition is potentially going to have an impact in a whole variety of ways, and that you can kind of start to develop and deliver projects in such a way that might suggest a way of changing that condition in quite a progressive way, so that's part, for me. I've never been really interested in kind of proper live project briefs where the students have a real client, because I feel like that's what you're doing. I kind of feel like that's what your year outs are meant to introduce you to. And also when I have been involved in those kind of projects, it tends to exploit the student in an on-site. You basically have someone who's getting students design something for them for free, and then at the end of that, no one really kind of gets what they really want quite often. But what I am interested in is like presenting students with very, very real situations and analyzing those situations and speaking to the people who live and work and engage and act in those situations. But then, the brief itself is maybe still something that is quite speculative, in its form. It's not, doesn't have to be real for it to kind of teach a way of engaging in the needs of the real world, basically. I mean, that's part of it. But I also think that, you can't. But I think the students should know about Louis Kahn and all those people who it's kind of good to know about, I suppose. But I think there's other voices need to start coming into that as well. I mean, obviously, I have colleagues and aware of other people in architecture education who keep referring to the canon. I always thought a cannon was like a big loud thing that shot at boats.
No. You got to know the language.
Yeah, exactly. And this is it. You've got to know the language. And then we've got to whatever diversify that canon a bit, and we've got a lot. And that's starting to happen and emerge. But I think there's obviously at the moment we're in a point of transition within architecture education and society at large, where a white middle class voice is having to give up, move aside, become less dominant in those conversations, and rightly so. I mean, I kind of don't necessarily have an issue with that kind of transition of diversity and accessibility at all, but that I think at the moment means that there's a kind of situation of tension and conflict within architectural education, where there's some stuff that we still don't want to let go of because it is kind of cool. There's all these like kind of weird, bullying, despotic, odd, dysfunctional male white architects who did do a lot of kind of interesting stuff,
pretty cool shapes.
and why not still learn about that. But the way we contextualize that can change. It's like you don't have to like just say we don't need any of that anymore to recontextualize how you speak about it or how you present it or how you teach it or whatever. And even though my own experience or interest has been in this kind of slightly more socially active or community-based, small-scale architecture, I realized in my own job early on that trying to impose that you know, at like every level, on every project, in every brief, in every part of an architecture education wasn't actually necessarily that useful, you know. And that, you know, you still need to have a plurality of voices and interests competing within an educational system, you know, and getting listened to within an educational system, and creating a situation where kind of discussion and arguments and different points of view happen. And there isn't some singular ideology imposed on the way everything gets taught. I kind of don't think that's healthy, to be honest.
Fantastic. I think we're going to leave it there, but that's covered a lot of ground. I think it's just very interesting that that your own education, Strathclyde seems to have had this impact, and certainly Glasgow has that impact on people, doesn't it? Of orientating or of enabling, I think, this kind of, I mean, smaller scale, more fragmentary, or more, is it more franchised kind of?
Well, I think I mean, Strathclyde, I don't know if I kind of realized it at the time that it was unique. And I also think that at the time I was at Strathclyde, there'd been a history of kind of community-based and activism-based architecture and design at Strathclyde over a number of years.
Yeah.
But I think that when I was there, and I didn't maybe realize until afterwards it was happening, was that the modernists within the staff were pushing back against that, actually, and like kind of gaining a bit more territory back, you know. And all of a sudden, I remember before we entered into like fourth year, for example, that fourth year had previously been run as a kind of small scale unit system where there was like a community design unit and there was another thing, you know, and then it became a kind of flat thing when we came into it, you know. And then the advanced architectural design masters at Strathclyde before we went into fifth year had been, you know, run by Jonathan Charlie, who is, you know, big socialist, and it had a certain kind of openness to it that was quite experimental, that didn't require buildings to be designed necessarily, that, you know, and there was a lot of kind of activism and discussion around these themes, and then that final year became something else when we entered it, which was another reason why I went into the urban design strand, because I still felt, you know, there was a place there to kind of ask some of these broader questions. And so but there was definitely a culture of participation, engagement, looking at architecture within these situations. And then Glasgow, obviously, you know, late 90s, early noughties, was really, 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 really looking hard at how to renew itself, you know. And even though, you know, I have a certain amount of antipathy to this, you know, like large scale master planning stuff and things like that, there's still no doubt that, you know, most of the time the intentions, I think, in the early noughties were good, you know, like the intentions were, even if the application wasn't necessarily always right. But again, that was the same in the 60s as well, you know. It was like, you know, no one designed and built tower blocks actually to trap poor people like
Are you sure?
on the outskirts of town. Like all of this stuff was built actually, usually, or conceived, if not built, with the best of intentions. You know, it was to take people from, you know, very, very unhealthy, toxic inner city slum environments and put them in green space and take them away from, you know. So yeah, I think that Strathclyde, you were kind of surrounded by a lot of good intentions at times. And that probably informed me more than I realized at the time it was informing me. And then you had this, you were in a city that made all of this stuff very visible, like very kind of latent. And for me anyway, that was kind of quite hard to ignore, I suppose.
Yeah. That's a nice point to finish on. Thanks ever so much. I'm going to stop recording. Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation, and it goes on and on. I'm interested to see how it keeps, whether we get anywhere with it, or whether this is just another turn of the same circle. As you say, it's in the 60s, it was in the 70s, it was probably a little bit in the 80s by some shady people, happened again in the 90s, and now we're back again thinking about how to engage communities, but hopefully something will happen. Anyway, thanks ever so much, Lee.